Well, it's that time of the year again, ladies and gentlemen, when the first signs of frost and the shortening of daylight hours compel a certain number of our archivists to huddle up regularly around the hearthside of the Great Hall, mostly to discuss all of the important books that they had read during the year and all of the insightful content that they had meant to produce but didn't. On one of this year's occasions, the boys had actually decided to watch a Studio Ghibli film just prior to their engagement in this seasonal ritual of slacking and unproductive banter. It was an opportunity for them to not only spend even less time working on their grand theory of technocracy and its links to Western occultism, which they had now been promising to their subscribers for years, but also an opportunity for them to match wits over who could stretch the meaning of the film more to fit as a cover for their own particular political narrative at the moment. You see, the 1994 animated classic, Pom Poko, is about a native population of Japanese raccoons who engage in a life and death struggle to protect their homeland and traditional way of life against an encroachment from the forces of globalization and modernity. The protagonists in the film are tasked with trying to stop a mega corporation from paving over their beloved native forest as it seeks to build a new suburban development in order to house its growing population of rootless, transitory wage slaves. The lads at the Iron Age archive simply couldn't help themselves and just had to spend an entire 2 hours drawing out the comparisons between the events and lessons taken from the film and the collective experiences that the dissident right had gone through over the past 8 years. The chance to joust over who had the most based film analysis and best hot takes was simply the only thing that could capture their attention that morning as they gathered around the toasty fire in the Great Hall bright and early, with notes and references on hand.
What the heck is that?
You don't know?
No, I don't know who
Ryan.
it is.
Also another AI bot that we're using to assist us today.
Hopefully it doesn't try and radicalize us to go after the queen like the other one did.
Yeah, I don't really have an intro planned. Let's see.
You should have like a song or something that by now, a custom song. Iron Age, the archive we all think of.
We've talked a lot about this movie one-on-one, I think.
Yeah, for sure. This is a movie that we've been talking about. Me and you, Bucklander, and me and you, Nathan, we've been talking about this movie 3 or so years. And what's interesting is that I've watched this movie now 4 times. One time apolitically, the second time as a libertarian, the third time as a kind of reactionary monarchist, and this time, just yesterday, as a Christian. And the reason why...
You can be a Christian and a reactionary monarchist at the same time.
Right, yeah, okay, sure. As a Christian / monarchist. But the reason why I keep coming back to this movie is because this movie tells the story of us, the dissident right. That's what I think. I think Miyazaki didn't intend that, certainly. He intended to write this movie as a environmentalist tale. But here's the thing. You can also be a Christian monarchist and an environmentalist. And so this movie is really ultimately about dissidents and about revolt against the modern world.
I was going to say, do you think it's possible that factions of the left would feel exactly the same way?
They would agree with like elements, but I don't think they'd agree with everything. I think Miyazaki, you say he didn't mean to, like, this is like source material for analyzing the problem. And different people are going to have different takeaways. And I think it is modernity. And I think, as so often is the case, Jeff and I had this conversation. Oh, I don't like so-and-so, but I really agree with his critique. I don't like his solutions, but I agree with his critique. Miyazaki is not even offering a solution, really. But I did think of a title for this episode.
Okay.
Surf the Kali Yuga with your nutsack.
Yeah. I hope people who are watching this have actually seen this movie because, well, we're going to spoil the entire thing, but there's a lot.
I don't think we've mentioned even what the movie is at this point.
Right. It'll be in the title.
We're not going to use my title idea?
Oh. Brackets Pom Poko. It definitely is a lesser known Studio Ghibli work. And it was originally released for television, actually. So that's why it's not that well known. Oh, one more thing I want to say is that to Nathan's comment, it's the left may agree with a lot of the things, but this is not the story of the left. That's what I think.
And I don't think it's the
Doesn't
story
line
of
up.
the right either. It's just a story.
I think there's a lot of things that line up between what the Raccoons do and their tactics and their attitudes towards revolt that line up with what a lot of the stuff that we were doing between 2015 and 2020.
Okay.
Yeah, that's going to be my thesis. What were you going to say?
I was going to, if we're laying out our theses, I think this is a thing I come back to. I've said this a few times about various things, usually about Christianity. Winning might not look like what you think winning will look like.
Yeah. That's the Christian story, isn't it?
Yeah. That's my kind of position.
Yeah. Laurentian, any thoughts before we get started?
Yeah, I guess the main thing that I saw was question where this story starts is how bad things are. You know, taking a step back and saying, okay, well, are things really so terrible, or am I getting these problems projected onto myself? I think that happens a little bit in this movie, and I think that's where I started.
So you found that certain characters within the movie were kind of playing woe is me, victimhood, rather than improving their own life?
Well, you know, the characters it was a reflection back to the past, first of all. And they said, you know, things were better in the past. We had great things. We had all the food we wanted to eat and all the freedom that we could ever enjoy. And you tend to look back on the past and your memories of things as an idealistic time period, but that's often not the case.
Right. Kind of like how we feel about the 90s.
Yeah, like as someone who lived in the 90s, there was a lot of nihilistic despair. It was more of the general malaise. It's not that it's any different now. It's just, you know, popular culture or what was being projected onto you was heroin and shitty music, right? Like shitty guitar rock. Those things were projected on me.
Yeah.
Live for today. That was more how I see it. It wasn't necessarily a time of great peace and prosperity. We just didn't have the internet.
Yeah, maybe one thing to be said about that is everybody who critiques modern times tends to have this view. Well, actually, no, not everybody. I should say it's definitely more prominent on the right, where we have this view that modern times sucks. So that's why we have to return with the V, return back to tradition. And certainly tradition is not bad in itself, but then you have to have a way in which tradition produces something that allows you to navigate the future. You can't just simply turn the clock back to the 90s or the 50s. Tradition isn't meant to be just this dead thing that it's a frozen moment in time. Tradition is something that's ongoing and living. And that's the only way that tradition is able to deal with the challenges of the future.
Yeah, I agree. Pandora's box has been opened and nothing's going back in.
Also, in a lot of the things that we've been reading lately, part of the problem is that it's a technological problem as well, where every civilization will have to contend with how technical progress is going to impact their civilization. And that's another one of the themes of this movie as well.
I've been thinking mostly about it from Heidegger and the question concerning technology and the sort of problem that the Raccoons have of they had no choice, that technology isn't framing them. And throughout the story, there's this problem that some of the Raccoons can shape change and some can't. And the ones that can't shape change are left with a really easy decision because there isn't a decision. They just sort of become like Uncle Ted Raccoons. And, you know, they just continue to live in this new world because, they don't win. The Raccoons don't win. But the win is that they make people aware of nature. And they're the ones that kind of, in Heidegger's scheme, are the anti-technologists. And Heidegger says, like, that's not going to solve anything. And it's not a perfect parallel because they don't have the choice. But the raccoons that do have a choice are able to shapeshift. It seems like they go and all of them just start to live as humans. And the question, like, what happens after that? That's the end of the movie, is like some raccoons who are able to shape change into humans running into some that aren't and catching up with their old friends in this field. And the ones that are able to shape change, presumably there would be this tension afterwards of forgetting that they're raccoons and just progressively living more and more and more as humans. And those are the ones that just sort of surrender to the technology. And it would be the raccoons that can shape change, that are aware of the artificiality of everything that's going on around them and are able to move in it, but not be controlled by it, at least in the way that they see the world, and are able to act in a way that is with reference to the world as it has changed. They're the ones that are sort of what Heidegger advocates, I think.
Well, what you said there, Bucklander, actually reminds me, it's kind of a Christian thing too, which is the degree to which you have to be in the world and not of it. And the ones who can't shapeshift are almost like monastics. They are the defenders of the faith in the end, who remove themselves from the world as much as possible. I mean, even today, you have certain monks, Orthodox monks, who have blogs or YouTube channels even. So there is this element where they're not entirely removed from the world. There certainly are monks on Mount Athos who are very, very much removed from the world. So there's always this degree, right? There's always levels, and certainly the majority of Christians are in cities in the world. They're in Rome.
I might argue that those of us who are on the internet with YouTube channels might be the furthest detached from reality.
That's interesting. Internet monasticism.
Now, before our good-natured presenters get carried away with their own individualized interpretations of the movie, I thought it would be pertinent here to provide a summary of how the movie actually starts out. The story begins with two factions of Japanese tanuki raccoons, who go on to fight one another over resources when they start to lose too much of their traditional living space to human migration and a new suburban development project in the Tama Hills area on the outskirts of Tokyo. According to Japanese folklore, tanuki have the ability to shapeshift and perform whimsical feats of magic, which the protagonists will end up using throughout the film to try and solve their predicament. We first encounter our ensemble cast of protagonists then, as they are locked in a skirmish over which faction of raccoons will have control over what's left of the forest in the region. As the two factions fight it out, an old matriarch raccoon named Oraku ultimately convinces the two sides to form an alliance and to turn their focuses away from fighting one another towards fighting against the humans instead. She accomplishes this by arguing that fighting among the tanuki would only lead to a hastening decline of their native population and an easier conquest by their modern human invaders.
So she starts chanting, go ahead, just fight among yourselves, just kill yourselves, and let the humans win. And this moment is actually maybe one of the first moments where I kind of saw the parallels between the dissident right and this movie and these raccoons. Because one of the kind of prominent features of the dissident right is infighting. And right now, a really popular thing going around in the Twitter sphere is no enemies to the right, which is this attempt to rationalize why we should stop fighting amongst ourselves. Because as we fight amongst ourselves, we're not getting anything done, and modernity is slowly encroaching more and more on our way of life. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this idea of no enemies to the right, or don't punch right. If infighting is healthy. Yeah.
Or if infighting is healthy. Well, my first reaction the first time that I saw the film was I didn't see it as a distinctly dissident right-wing film, even though I can appreciate why it would be interpreted that way. I saw it more like, there was the group of raccoons that wore red and there was the group that wore blue. And the red were like the young, upstart, revolutionary types, and the blue were kind of more cautious and you could say more conservative-minded in that sense. And
Yes.
I think that Japan is just generally more right-wing, period. So it could be, even though we would call it dissident right here, it could be fairly centrist there in that sort of a context. But as to right-wing infighting, whether or not we should, I know that I've lost respect for my enemies when I see that they don't have the capacity to self-critique. And even though I appreciate the sort of tactical advantages of, hey, let's not nitpick, let's not purity spiral, let's choose our battles, and let's make sure that we're on the same page about the important things and who cares about the smaller stuff. I can appreciate that. But sooner or later, bigger things do come up that we do need to have the capacity to critique our own. And if I'm expecting to, in good faith, engage with people on the other side, I would expect the same thing to be expected of us too, and that's that we would be able to call out our own. But I think that there's something to be said for a lot of those things need to be in-house conversations. And with the nature of social media, it tends to happen publicly first and then privately second. And it probably should be, if we're allies here, we need to have the conversations privately first and then publicly second, if that fails.
Right. Because the other issue with social media is it tends to give into this mob mentality where passions flare and there's kind of no way to, or it's very difficult at least, to restrain all of that vitriol when you're in this public sphere. Whereas, probably a lot of these people who disagree, if they met up one-on-one, they wouldn't have blown this conflict way out of proportion the way they do on Twitter.
Totally. It absolutely incentivizes that.
Yeah. And so the raccoons do decide to listen to the old matriarch raccoon, and they sit down to hash out a new plan. And their plan is a 2-point plan. Point number 1 is that they are going to research the humans, learn more about the humans, and find out their weaknesses. And the second plan, part of the plan, is that they're going to bring back transformation. Form changing, which is something that's kind of fallen a bit out of practice, I guess.
Is there any explanation for why it is that they stopped?
They get lazy.
Yeah.
Because the ones in Shikoku preserve the tradition.
Right.
Which is why they go to Shikoku to get the masters.
Mm-hmm. And one way to look at that also is that I go back to the 90s and the early 2000s when there was very little talk about politics at that time. When I grew up, I was very, very oblivious of politics. So it's like when life gets a certain way, a lot of that stuff kind of falls to the wayside.
I remember, I look back now and I don't even know what they were about because I grew up in the States. I remember every now and then I'd look at the TV and there would be people that I knew and something about Newt Gingrich and President Clinton. And I think back now, what the hell were they arguing? What actually were Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton actually fundamentally disagreeing on? And it's sort of funny to think that once upon a time.
Do you think that it was always just as political back then, but we were essentially too young to really see it? When you're a kid, it's easy to tune stuff out. And we might say that, well, they're politicizing people younger and younger now too. Like the kids are being bombarded with all these messages, but who's to say it's not just rolling straight off their backs as well? And then, once they reach a certain age where they're kind of politically enlightened or whatever, or politically aware, then suddenly they look back at the next generation and say, oh, it's been there all along. And the next generation is being bombarded with these messages as well.
Well, there certainly has been a heavy politicization kind of during the George Bush era. I remember when the MTV and, P. Diddy was promoting Vote or Die or something, Rock the Vote and all this stuff. Young people were beginning to take note of politics in a way that they hadn't been in the previous Bill Clinton era. And I'm sure that there were other times in history when politics would seep into every aspect of life, more so than they did in the 90s. So I guess getting back to Pom Poko, it's just that sometimes when life is a certain way, other issues kind of fall to the wayside. And so there is less of a need for the raccoons to exercise their transformation arts.
All I did
as to what my take on the 90s is, and I think it's both. I think politics has become more mainstream because it's been dumbed down.
I think it's something that used to be at a distance because it was serious, that there's serious people running and there's serious problems. I think there's a certain amount of what we see and what we experience politically that's just, not only is it not relevant, it's more of a distraction. And I saw that develop more and more over the years. So to relate that back to the film, you know, is there somewhere else you could go, or is there something else you could do, or maybe desire something less or different in order that you can just live your life? Like, if you want to be plugged into today's Senate hearings or news cycle, it's very simple and easy. It's very accessible. It's very dumbed down.
I totally agree with that analysis. That's really what it is there's been the pop culturization of politics, where when I was a kid growing up, it felt like they were actual professionals. And it seemed like there was a barrier to entry where you had to be intelligent enough and interested enough. And now there have been all these attempts to just force everyone to be political actors and surround their lives with it. And that hasn't happened in a way that is too serious. It's super dumbed down. You know, you look at like Kamala Harris explaining what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and she's speaking to people as if they're 5-year-olds, you know? You have a really big country and then you have a really small country, you know? And it's like, these are the leaders now?
Yeah. And the problem is that everybody has to have an opinion on every issue. So even your 16-year-old has to have an opinion on Israel right now. And it's like, what, you don't support transgenderism? What's wrong with you? Read a book. There's the whole attitude that everybody has to have an opinion on every political issue, and every issue has to be political.
And it's not even that you need to have an opinion, you need to have the right opinion, like the mainline one.
Yeah. So I think the raccoon's ability to transform is analogous to what we had in the form of meme magic, because ultimately the raccoons use their transformation powers for mischief and to troll, and they're hoping to change hearts and minds. But ultimately, it comes down to mischief and trolling. So that's another reason why I found this movie, especially when I watched it the second time, that is this movie about us? Because at that time, it was the time of meme magic. And yeah, I watched the movie the second time in 2016.
Yeah, it was okay. Meme magic was okay, and it's enjoyable at the time, but what's the game plan long term? Is it just fun to have fun? Yeah, for sure. But if you're, banking to have a political movement or environmental movement in this case, based on those things, it's a lot more difficult.
I wrote in my notes, the raccoons are terribly disorganized and unserious. And actually, if you take note, the majority of people who are in our political sphere, the dissident right, who do this full time, are just content creators. There's very few people who are doing things outside of that. So I don't know if that's a problem or not, but it seems like kind of strange for a political movement.
I remember Sargon of Akkad, he was super frustrated with the other anti-SJW content creators because none of them would ever read a book. and to him, it's like, we need to elevate, we need to grow, we need to dig into the philosophical traditions here, and just no one would read a book, and he started to get increasingly pissed off.
Well, I'd say that there's definitely room to expand in that aspect. We can't just have a movement of 99% content creators. Every other political movement in history has had people who do other roles. And that seems to be one of the problems with the raccoons as well, is that they ended up playing this game of one-upmanship in their trolling, where they launch one meme campaign, and then it's like, oh, well, I can do the meme campaign better. I control the humans better. And it's just a game of one-upmanship. And each time they do it, they celebrate like they've won a great victory. But yeah, we finally captured.
Okay, this is chaotic.
Sorry, I can't figure out how to turn off my fire alarm. No, I'm working on it. Sorry.
Okay,
It's the meme magic.
that's the meme alarm.
Isn't there a meme going around about people that don't change the batteries in the fire alarm? Is that the...
I know about that meme. Yeah. They tend to celebrate the memes more than any actual success in what they're trying to accomplish, which is to save their homeland. And it's kind of like, yeah, we captured Shia LaBeouf's flag for the 17th time. You know, we're winning, boys.
Yeah, it's a tough balance because there is something to be said for you should be having a lot of fun. There's something that, to me anyway, there's something so appealing about the group of people that are laughing, and not the weird, disingenuous laughing, but the groups that are actually sincerely having fun. There's something so pure about that I know I'm drawn to it, but you're right. It should be somewhere along the way. It should at least be productive.
Well, we actually learn later in the movie that raccoons in other regions of Japan had actually succeeded using their transformation magic to stop the humans from developing over their forests. And actually, one of the differences, it's very subtle, but one of the differences you see is that when the master from the other island talks about how his campaign succeeded, it's because the humans actually developed a reverent fear of the raccoons. Whereas the difference between the raccoons in the main story, the raccoons on Tama Hill, is that all of their trolling revolves around destruction and this kind of like humorous, unserious type of transformation magic. You know, it's basically frog memes.
That kind of brings me back to what you were saying about this being a dissident right story. And I'm wondering if part of the reason that you're seeing it as dissident right is because of the use of meme magic. Is that really the key point? Okay, so if we're to just see these things as magic, the left historically is usually more involved in occult magic type stuff, right? Like they're the witches, they're doing their weird seances where Donald Trump gets cursed or whatever weird thing that they're doing, right? Mm-hmm. But they're doing more of the what's considered that traditional malicious, they're serious about it. Whereas the right, yeah, it was meme magic, it was joking. There was a question as to whether it was even magic at all, or if that's just an exaggeration to kind of get a point across.
Yeah. And if you look at something like Bohemian Grove, on the one hand, you could say that that's kind of just like goofy elites being ridiculous. But on the other hand, nobody thinks it's entirely a joke. Nobody thinks that we're dealing with unserious people because they're doing Bohemian Grove. Or even Marina Abramovich's cannibal dinners. Nobody thinks that now because they do that, we're dealing with unserious people. In fact, the right has developed a reverent fear because they engage in these kind of occult ritual magic. And I think that, well, I think to some degree, mainstream does have a little bit of a fear of the right as well. But in a lot of our memes, it does seem like we're a lot less to be taken seriously than something like Bohemian Grove.
Well, an interesting comparison to make too is, are you familiar what happened with Hategate and the whole Diagon movement?
Not really, no.
So Diagon was very similar to Kekistan, like a fictional meme country that doesn't exist, that started to gain a lot of popularity during lockdowns. And it was kind of led, if you could call it that, even though it was just a live stream and an internet fandom. But it revolved around a live streamer who was a 14-year combat veteran. And you eventually had, during the convoy protests, you had the Senate and the House of Commons all referencing Diagon as justifications to issue the Emergency Measures Act. And everyone within Diagon was like, what? This is a joke. It's a meme. They're taking it seriously. So on the one hand, they're like, haha, we tricked them. We pranked them. They're going to look so stupid. Basically, the government of Canada waged war against Kekistan, like officially. But then once people issued a Freedom of Information request, they discovered that the RCMP, the intelligence networks, they knew it was a joke all along. They knew it wasn't any sort of terrorist organization, and they couldn't even define it as a group. But it was expedient for their narrative. So on the one hand, it's like, haha, the right wing, everyone's just joking around, it's all fun and games. But on the other hand, the left is pretending to take it seriously when it's in their interest to do so.
You bring up another interesting element, which is that sometimes we don't know when we're being serious or not.
Well, what I've observed, there's the idea of irony poisoning, right? Where people will say that if you're saying something that you shouldn't be allowed to say, as long as you say it in a joke, that's how people get away with it. But I've noticed that, something isn't either just a joke or just true. It can be both. And where the line is where it gets really confusing.
Right. Jan 5th is an example that comes to my mind. Like, are we doing this, or are we kind of just going to go in and mess around, or are we serious about taking back the Republic? I don't know. And I actually didn't know on January 5th. I was hoping they were serious in some sense, but I kind of knew that they also weren't.
I think the correct terminology to use is patsy, right? Are you being used against yourself while producing your own information? I think that's the correct terminology to use, is patsy. And I was thinking of Diagon this morning actually as well. Like, okay, you've created this fictitious idea, this fictitious concept. You've achieved some level of notoriety in trying to own, like, look at how stupid these people are. But these people aren't concerned with their own legitimacy. You could make something up. They could latch on to anything whatsoever. As long as everybody in the group is repeating it ad nauseum, it's going to be a thing. And it's going to be used either for them or against you, or both, if you're a willing participant in this exercise, if you are a patsy. But Diagon and the people involved with it, I think, maybe reflected that afterwards. But, the immediate reaction is just like, these people are taking it seriously. And to whatever extent they can, they will. Intention or not, you've given them something to work with, and that's all they need. They don't care about how ridiculous they look or how history views them, or even whatever points they bring up. It's the fact that you've given them some kind of ammunition to use against, to have people's attention. And I even questioned how much attention was given to these ideas at all. I think it was brought to prominence, but what came out of it, it's hard to say.
Yeah, I think both parties in each case are going to interpret things in their best interest. So when you have the people who are kind of unserious memeing, on the one hand, it's like, well, we're not really serious, but if it works, then it becomes serious, and then it's real. And we're going to take that victory. We're going to accept that, right? But if it fails, then there's plausible deniability. It was just a joke anyway. The difficulty, though, is that if it is a joke, then when it's a joke and people get treated like it's serious and it's real, then there's a habit of it becoming real, because it's like, well, you're going to treat me the same way anyway. And I was joking, but I'm serious now. That can happen sometimes. But then on the flip side, when you have the establishment, like you guys were saying, that they're not worried about their own credibility. They don't care that it makes them look stupid, because they're in control of whatever the levers of communication anyway. So they shape perception. And in the movie, in Pom Poko, you saw that when, they conduct this big operation, they scare a whole bunch of people or whatever, and they're like, yes, we did it. And then on the news, I forget exactly what happened, but they spin it some completely different way. It's like, what was it? Like, the mayor did that. They were responsible for the parade to welcome everyone, or something like that.
A whole publicity stunt.
Exactly. So even their victory just gets transformed into something that's antithetical to their interests.
Yeah.
I'm back. I'm kind of
okay.
Sorry.
Have you been listening the whole time, or you missed?
No.
Okay.
It's just stupid.
Okay. We're just talking about the Raccoons meme magic and their trolling. One of the things that I found funny also was that the Raccoons decide to take a year off from having kids and starting families just to join the meme war. And even the females get mobilized. I just thought that that's a funny little parallel that we have today. I'm not saying that the meme war necessarily takes us away from starting families, but it is a bit of a...
But it doesn't work. They still end up having kids.
Well, they do take 1 year off, actually, and then they have kids the next spring.
I thought it was that they didn't have kids at all.
Well, they were going to try to take a second year off, but they failed the second year. They did take the first year off, actually.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not saying that memes necessarily prevent dissidents from having kids in real life, but there is this manner in which all of the unseriousness and the kind of whole attitude, it's a form of prolonged adolescence sometimes. I think it can tend towards that, where the way that we approach politics reflects the way that we approach life as well. And my online life, for better or worse, it does actually seep into my real life. So
the meme war temptation is that you lose sight of the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
You get caught up in everything that's going on, whatever's happening. And I'm always suspicious when current thing is happening, that like the point of current thing is to get me to freak out about current thing instead of be looking where I'm supposed to be looking, so that I miss the point of what's really going on, you know? And the problem is it's so easy to start spiraling out on that. And, you know, I don't have a family. I went on a promising date last night, which is why we're recording this on Wednesday and not Tuesday. So hopefully that's going to change soon. But yeah, I imagine having kids grounds you. Yeah.
Jonathan Pajot also says this thing about the importance of going to church, because you're in the world 6 days out of the week, getting distracted by all the worldly things. But at least that seventh day is there to remind you what it's all for. It's meant to direct your focus towards the thing that transcends the world. And when you put your focus on the highest thing, then everything, all the other values flow downward from that. And it aligns everything properly.
The problem is, for many of us, and I don't think that this is, you know, it's easy to get partisan about denominations on this one, but I think it seems to me every denomination has its problems. And what are you supposed to do when your denomination makes every week is about current thing? Especially for some denominations. Some denominations are definitely worse than others, right? Like Episcopalians are definitely worse than just about any other church. Sorry, Episcopalians. I highly doubt any Episcopalians listen to this unless they're like partisan Anglicans who refuse to give up on the Episcopal Church. So yeah, great. Go to church. Wonderful. But even there, the churches have been infiltrated and infected. And
well, I would say that for the churches who still have a traditional liturgy or mass, then within the liturgy, there cannot be a focus. It's almost impossible for the world to seep into that, except for the homily, right? The sermon.
Yeah.
Again, I go back to what I asked about whether the people on the internet are sort of like the furthest removed from the world in a way. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to make a comparison between the church and our online shenanigans and everything, but I've never really looked at a lot of this stuff that's happening on the internet as the world. And part of that has to do with the nature of my content has been just very bizarre lore. It's creating this weird fictional world for myself to entertain myself. I'm almost like creating my own mental utopia in a way. And yeah, sometimes you get caught up in current thing and it kind of drags you in a weird direction, but you just have to make sure that you're asserting your own ideas as well. And to go back to the raccoons and how they take a year off from having children and everything, and then they fall into doing that anyway. It's like, yeah, sometimes the mean procrastination, that is the case some of the time, but also the raccoons had a very serious threat in front of them that may have actually been a higher priority than having children. It's like, what sort of a world are the children even going to inherit if they don't solve this problem in the first place?
Right.
And ultimately their failure to solve that problem, they get complacent and they start to have children again.
Right.
And I mean, like,
that is a dangerous attitude, right?
That's both ways.
Yeah, that's a dangerous outlook, because then what if the world never,
exactly,
in your perception, the world never seems to get any better, then you just never end up having kids.
But even
exactly. So some people get lost in that for sure.
But even winning, right? Like even if you win but there's no kids, like what was the point of winning?
There's a biological reality, especially for the females, right? And the females are the ones who jump in.
Yeah.
So there's a whole fun and game sequence. There's a training sequence, and then they go out and start practicing their transformation magic, how to blend in among the humans. And then it's revealed that, the hot-headed revolutionary, Gonta, it's already revealed that he is this hot-headed guy in the beginning, but Gonta starts to get really, really serious and angry when he finds out that his childhood home ground, the place where he grew up, has been deforested. And then he gets very angry and proposes that it's time to seek retribution. It's time to accelerate the plan, because they've been training this whole time and waiting for the masters from overseas to come and help them. So they've sent messengers out to the other regions of Japan to bring these legendary masters to come help them train. And Gonta says, enough of this stuff. Let's stop. Let's stop talking about ideas. It's time for action.
Yeah, we've had that conversation in the Iron Age archive.
Well, yeah. And I think a lot of people have actually, I mean, this is a very common debate online anyway. So a lot of people have certainly encountered the Gonta type, which is like, what are we even doing here? And it's like, oh, the latest outrage. Check this latest outrage out. Are you just going to hide in your little book club, or are you going to finally make a stand?
And then there's always the accusation that they're fed. Anyone who's trying to get you to turn what you're doing into real world action, it's like, oh, they're probably fed.
I don't know, Nathan, that sounds like something the Fed would say.
Exactly, yeah.
Interestingly enough, the Gonta of the Iron Age archive, who I think is the Gonta of the Iron Age archive, is actually somebody that I used to butt heads a lot with online, but ever since we started meeting up in person, we've become really good friends. And actually, he even admits his internet personality is way more wild than he is in real life.
Is
so
this who I think it? Can you message me?
Shout out Broleaf. And it's interesting. It's online does have this effect. When you're in this public forum, it does affect your personality. It affects my personality too, actually. Right. I think the combination of Gonta's hot-headedness and the latest outrage, which is his childhood home being destroyed, and the fact that he is a public figure, a public leader in this movement, come together in this action-oriented revolutionary. And unlike a lot of online revolutionaries, Gonta actually decides to take action. So Gonta gathers up a bunch of his followers, and he convinces even Shokichi. Shokichi is the blue faction, a prominent member of the blue faction, who is this more intellectual type, who is more careful, more go with the plan. And there's even a part where Shokichi trust the plan. And Shokichi even talks about things like when the raccoons take back the forest, he has this rebuilding plan. He has this plan to reforest, regrow a bunch of fruit trees, and how the future will look. So Shokichi is definitely this long-term thinker who is the opposite of Gonta. But Gonta even convinces Shokichi to come along on his serious campaign. And the serious campaign comes when they decide to attack the construction site.
Gonta and his crew of revolutionaries attack the construction site on a dark and stormy evening. They conjure up several clever illusions that cause havoc on the site, which lead to a number of severe accidents, and even the deaths of multiple construction workers. For the first time in their campaign, it appeared as though the raccoons had finally done something to push back against the incursion from their enemies. And as the raccoons gathered together to watch the evening news report on their endeavor, they couldn't help but joyously celebrate over their momentary triumph.
There's a big temptation there, and the temptation is that any activity will be positive and productive, which I don't think is the case. You know, you need to know when to act and when not to act, and it feels good to act, but doesn't necessarily mean that you will be doing the right thing.
Before the celebrations get too far out of hand, the elder raccoon, Osho, attempts to settle the younger raccoons down and remind them of the gravity of the situation. The raccoons had now crossed the threshold into a violent engagement with the humans, and because several innocent construction workers had lost their lives, the elders thought it would be appropriate to have a moment of silent prayer to honor the deceased. The younger raccoons decide to oblige, and for the occasion, they even calmly put on funeral attire and prepare themselves for a moment of solemnity. But as the prayer for the dead proceeds, the young raccoons show themselves to be incapable of containing themselves, and they begin to burst out into laughter. It is not long until the room erupts into a frenzy of celebration and ecstasy as the raccoons begin to chant, "We saved our forest, we saved our forest." It appeared as though only the older raccoons were capable of any kind of reverence, and that the young were fated to be carried away by the whims of their fickle temperaments. As the heroes of the campaign join the celebration, the raccoons gather to hoist Ganta up into the air and hail him as their great champion. But the festivities then come to a sudden halt when it is reported by the news that construction on the development will in fact not be delayed at all, despite the destruction that the raccoons had caused. In a moment of panic and confusion, the raccoons unwittingly drop Ganta to the ground, and he then proceeds to get badly trampled, as the riled-up raccoons rush towards the television to hear more on the latest developments. Much to their dismay, it appears as though the efforts of Ganta and his crew had actually done very little to slow down the ongoing invasion of the humans into their homeland. The raccoons were now once again at a loss.
He gets severely injured during the party. Basically, they're throwing him up and down in a kind of hero's welcome, and then they drop him when they hear the bad news that the construction project will not be delayed. And he breaks pretty much every bone in his body. There could be a metaphor there, if I stretch it, which is like, we'll give the heroes welcome to anybody who has a successful campaign, but we're also very quick to drop our heroes in the revolution, the quote-unquote revolution.
And it being the act of an early celebration.
Yeah.
There's a historical context to that as well. Victor Davis Hanson wrote a book that's called The Savior Generals. And he goes back into Greek times. I believe it was the Peloponnesian War. I can't remember which general he used exactly.
Is it Pericles?
The same kind of scenario where they brought him in to save everybody, and he did so with his elite military skill. And then after they were done with him, they immediately jailed him because they realized that he was more of a threat, that these people who are going to save us will be seen as more of a threat, or could be more of a threat than, somebody who's able to continue on with managing society. People want the quote unquote steady hands.
I mean, that's sort of the fate of the warrior class in a lot of respects too, where, what was it, Rambo First Blood, where you have these people who have to kind of become like monsters in order to go to war, and they're useful when the society is in trouble, when they need someone to protect them, but they don't really want them around. Once the threat has been resolved, they're scary because in some ways, they're monstrous.
That's the plot of one of Shakespeare's plays, Coriolanus. I'm not sure if I'm saying that. And he's like a Roman general who goes off and is very, very successful, but he has nothing but he looks down his nose in this aristocratic warrior way at the people that he saved. And then they send him into exile. Mm-hmm. And then he offers himself up to the Celtic tribe that he'd been fighting. And then he's very successful against Rome. And then he makes peace with Rome as he's winning. And then the Celts kill him because he lacked a will to kill his four people.
It also reminds me of that meme, after the glorious revolution, I'm going to be a poet or I'm going to be an artist.
We already got our one poet.
Yeah. So after the raccoons get blackpilled by the news, they actually continue watching TV and they learn of a new human weakness, which is superstition. With the new news, their hope gets renewed and they say, okay, new plan. And to give them credit, the new plan is much more clever than the old plan, because now it's actually based on knowledge of the enemy. It's something new that they've learned. And so they form a new meme campaign to terrorize the citizens of Tamahill and the construction workers. And so they start playing on the human superstitions, and they transform themselves into faceless human beings, very scary images, floating lanterns and this kind of stuff, ghosts. And again, they have a very successful campaign. They make the news again, and it's like, we did it, guys. We've won back our homeland. But this time, Gonta, in his injured state, he actually is able to see things more objectively, and he chastises the other raccoons. What are you guys celebrating about? You've done absolutely nothing. You may have temporarily scared a few people away, but you've not stopped the machine in any way. And then it cuts to this montage of the town continue to be built. And the narrator says, the rivers were paved with concrete and the forest trails became roads. So we really see this onslaught of technicization happening to the forest. Yeah.
Some of the raccoons felt good about it. Is that what you're going to say?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Some of the raccoons actually completely disregarded this stuff, and they thought that they were winning, and they were like, keep memeing, boys. We're going to get them. And then there becomes this game of one-upmanship between the raccoons to see who can do the best meme campaign.
It's a weird movie because I can't keep track of the sequence of events. And I only watched it a couple of days ago. Yeah. And if it helps, I don't know if this is a help, but apparently Miyazaki is like, he has no idea where the thing is going. He starts writing stuff like while it's happening.
I think that this was, sorry to interrupt real quick, but I think that this is one of the only Studio Ghibli movies that wasn't actually written by Miyazaki. I think this was someone else.
Oh, really? Okay.
No. Yeah, because a lot of times we don't necessarily perceive stories as entirely linear too. Like sometimes for us, they're sort of jumbled nonsense. But yeah, this was the co-founder of the studio.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that doesn't mean it wasn't done that way, but it is still a weird, every Ghibli movie, I'm like, this is a weird narrative. It's not like a straightforward, traditional story.
So Shokichi, one night he's staring up at the full moon and he's reflecting on whether or not Gonta is right, that ultimately all of this meme magic is doing absolutely nothing, and that maybe there is a necessity to violence or a necessity to radical action. I don't know if we want to comment on that or not, but Shokichi gets distracted by his love interest. I forget her name, but the love interest is basically flirting with him. And then they actually get into a conversation about this latest meme that Shokichi's been thinking about, which is called Operation Twin Star. And the love interest decides that she's going to help him out with Operation Twin Star. So Operation Twin Star is when they decide to dress up as a pair of weird little twin kids. And then they show up at the construction site when the construction workers are chilling off work. And they talk in like this weird alien tone. And then they freak the workers out by climbing over the walls and knocking over all their stuff, transforming into these ghouls. And so the construction workers get so freaked out that they walk off the job the next day. They say, oh, you can't pay me enough to work this job. And then again, the raccoons think, yes, what a great campaign. And it turns out that the day the workers walk off the site, immediately they're replaced with new workers. And this is when
I was just going to say,
there's an endless supply of humans. Yeah.
I kind of can't blame them for not really knowing, like if all they're doing is just sort of general mischief and really small, tiny little victories that ultimately don't accomplish anything in the larger scheme. I almost don't really blame them because what they're up against is so large that who has the key to dismantle it, right? This is a larger problem that not only can the raccoons not deal with it, but the humans themselves have to contend with it as well. And, to make the comparison with something like January 6th, it's like, okay, so you occupied this building what did you think it was going to accomplish? What, the whole deep state, everything just rolls over and like you win? Like at a certain point, these things, they've gotten so big that who knows how to dismantle them? I don't know that anyone does. So yeah, it's unfortunate for the raccoons, but that's the best that they've got.
Right. There is this argument for incremental victories too, which is, you may not have necessarily stopped or halted the machine to a huge degree, but maybe in some way your little mischief did cause some people to change their minds, or did have something that will have some ripple effect that will affect something in the long run. It's really hard to judge that kind of thing.
Well, and sometimes it's just the catharsis of being able to show that the machine can bleed. And the way that that inspires other people as well.
That's a good point, yeah. By the way, speaking of our technological society, Laurentian's phone has run out of battery, so he won't be returning.
Why would the Rothschilds do this? We had fire alarms and cell phone batteries, and
so there's this scene right afterwards where the raccoons actually go to the library, they read a book, and they actually read about raccoon history. And one of the things that they discover about raccoon history is that when raccoons historically got too mischievous using their magic, there were actually these huge extermination campaigns by humans, where humans basically wiped out the raccoons in that area because they got too mischievous. And so this is another black pill for the raccoons. And there's something to be said here about learning lessons from history, but also that when you poke the bear, be warned that eventually the bear is a bear.
The problem is that a lot of guys have is a lot of people have, on both sides. They think that we're dealing with this like static battlefield, and they don't understand that when you do something, there will be a reaction. You will displace something. The idea that you're just going to have this nice, smooth, knock over the bits of resistance one by one, that everyone's just going to sit there and let it happen as you roll over this thing and then that thing and then that thing. It never works that way. And you can be a victim of your own success. You can do things. You can be so successful that it gains attention and people come down on it. And it's a difficult thing to balance, how to win in a way that will keep you alive at the end of the game. Because the first thing that happens in Risk, who does everybody attack? The guy who's just dominated in the first couple of turns. So it doesn't do you a lot of good to dominate in a way.
And I think that has a lot to do with why they're always pretending to be the oppressed. They're always the resistance. The establishment is. They're feigning weakness because, the reality is that if they were totally transparent about what it is and what they're doing, then people would actually rally forces against them. But they always have to pretend that, they're really hard done by.
Yeah, that's a really clever technique that they're using there.
Well, there's a post on Twitter today I saw. Someone's like, that's what democracy is. Democracy has become this thing of like, I'm the underdog and you don't want those other guys to keep winning or something. So vote for me because
I'm giving voice to the voiceless.
Right. Whereas, well, first off, it's like the politics of ressentiment, Nietzsche's ressentiment. But the other thing is that, what is a good society? A good society, I would define, it would be a society that allows like the strong, the actually strong, to be strong, but still continues to take care of its weak. And what we become is a society in which the weak dictate to the strong, and the strong have no incentive to show up. There's no reason for the strong increasingly to keep performing. And my big concern, just objectively for the future of Western society, is what is it going to look like? And I don't know, either we're going to have a major collapse, or we're going to find out that the economy is fake and gay, and none of this matters, right? Like it's just pretend money. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. When you go back to that Shakespeare play that you were mentioning, what happens when you alienate the strong? They turn on you. They turn on society. And, in extreme cases, Uncle Ted was pretty high IQ and academic and.
Uncle Ted went off the deep end. He backed a group.
Yeah.
He backed well, I just want to point out to everyone, I like Uncle Ted as much as the next guy. But he threw his support behind a group that a big part of the group was radical green revolutionary feminism. And when I found that out, I was like, oh, they got to you too. They routinely have days where men are not allowed to talk. Like men can only talk in response. Conversations have to be female led. And I was like, how? Why did you do this, Uncle? Why,
That's interesting because
you either die a hero or you live long enough to become a villain.
Yeah. What's interesting is though that he was an avid reader of Jacques Ellul, and he wasn't able to see the technicity in that kind of society that he was supporting, where they have this entire technical system of who can speak at what time, even though he was a critique of this oncoming creep of everything in society becoming technical. Anyway, that was one element that was missing from this movie, was that they never got infiltrated. Well, no, there was that too, but that it never got infiltrated by glowies.
There's an asymmetry to the Raccoons' struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were being encroached upon, but they could kind of completely control their response.
Yeah. Well, in a way, the Raccoons have this advantage. They always know who's a raccoon and who isn't.
Yeah. Unless they're a fox. But the foxes never really betrayed the Raccoons. I think the first time I watched it, I was waiting for something like that to happen.
Right.
Like it was going to turn out that the foxes were dickheads. And
no, it turns out they were sincere. They made a sincere offer to the Raccoons later. So the Raccoons become very black-pilled, and then they decide that, screw it, we're just going to have kids. We're not going to... we don't know what to do, so we're just going to go back to regular life, and, we're going to eat and be raccoons. We're going to have kids.
They took the Lawrence Southern route, where they got jaded about politics and decided to start a family.
Yeah.
If I can use a bad word, I'm somewhat reluctant to reference him. In the words of George Lincoln Rockwell, if they won't fuck, they won't fight. So I quite like that as a quote. He didn't want guys in the organization that weren't out having babies. I don't know if it was like get in the game or what, but it's just an interesting, an interesting quote.
Yeah. Kind of bait. I can go with that. Yeah. But in this case, Gonta tries to launch a military coup because he's tired of the Raccoons just sitting around and moping and being normies and just talking about future plans.
Actually, I wonder how some of that relates to one of the more peculiar elements of the movie that hasn't come up yet, I think, is just like their testicles and how important they are for war.
That's why I said ride the Kali Yuga with your ball sack.
Yeah.
Beginning.
It's interesting, though, that the Raccoons who do end up inflating their ball sacks are all the ones who end up dying.
Oh, right, because they got in Gonta's kamikaze charge.
Yeah. And the other ones were the ones that crafted the party boat out of the old master's ball sack.
I don't know.
I don't know. Let's not get too far ahead right now.
Oh, sorry. Well, I can't remember when it happens.
Yeah.
It's a long movie too.
It
is a long movie.
Yeah.
I remember I sat down last Christmas. I was at my stepmom's, and Christmas at my stepmom's is weird for me because I actually have to talk to people, and I feel bad just sitting there being on my computer all the time. So, I was looking for a movie, and my stepmom quite likes animation and that sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, well, what about a Studio Ghibli? That would be good. And so I put on Pom Poko for her, and I was like, oh shit, I forgot about the ball sacks. And that was weird, and I just sort of laughed about it, and weird bit.
Yeah. It just
would you show how
really
would you show this to your daughter, Jeff?
No, I don't think I would show it to her until she's a lot older, until she takes an interest in something political or environmental.
Do you think it's a Japanese thing that they just have a different sense of what kids can handle, and therefore
It could be. Yeah.
They'll be like, yeah, okay, ball sacks.
Well,
Well,
you compare it
it's
to like My
already
Neighbor Totoro, and Totoro is obviously much more universal, right?
Yeah.
it's already a bit of Japanese culture though too. Like little kids would already see those raccoon statues at the shrines with their giant testicles. It's already been established. So the movie isn't introducing anything new. It comes from some sort of tradition where those raccoons, they would use their testicles as coin purses.
Oh,
And somehow that wealth got equated with the ability to like assert influence, which I guess in the movie is interpreted as having additional magic powers or something.
right. Okay. Yeah, well, ultimately, magic is about your ability to manipulate the worldly materials, right? And I guess, yeah, Japanese people would also have this context. The raccoons are like the sacred guardians of the forest. So they would understand it that way too.
Ganta's coup is his attempt to take over the leadership role within the raccoon movement. Ganta expresses his desire to lead the raccoons into direct, violent confrontation with the humans, while also imposing a more dictatorial style of leadership and command. The coup fails, however, when a discussion about food breaks out during the negotiations, and the raccoons show themselves to be too exhausted to continue fighting. All of the vigor and enthusiasm that the raccoons once had for their cause had now been burnt up. But just as the movement was about to teeter out and run dry of ideas, the old masters from the island of Shikoku finally arrive at Tama Hills. Upon their arrival, the old masters call a conference to discuss how the raccoons can drive the humans out of their territory by employing the same strategies that the masters had used successfully on Shikoku. The old masters insist that the raccoons must win back the respect that the humans once had for them. And in order to win back this respect, the masters begin preparing the raccoons for Operation Spectre. The operation, this time, would harness the full potential of each raccoon's magical abilities, allowing them to utilize even their surrounding environments to conjure up transformations and illusions on an unprecedented scale. The raccoons wholeheartedly believe that after such an astonishing display of sorcery and mysticism, that the humans will no longer be able to ignore their plight and finally recognize the raccoons as a rival to be respected and esteemed.
And I think, Bucklander, you might have had your alarm going off when I mentioned this. It's that there is a subtle difference between the way the old masters did their campaigns and the way that the raccoons on Tama Hill are doing theirs, which is that the old masters were able to successfully generate a reverent fear among the human population of the raccoons.
Mm-hmm.
They presented themselves in a way that harkened back to the old mythologies of Japan. And so the human populations there really did believe that they were encountering the gods of the forest. And through that kind of back and forth interaction that they had, the humans did eventually decide not to develop over their forest. But with the raccoons on Tama Hill, they're destroying property, they're freaking humans out with weird imagery, aliens, all this modern stuff, and it doesn't seem to be working. So there is a very subtle difference between the way that both of them are doing the memeing. But the old masters do propose that they take control of the meme war and that they're going to launch an operation that this time it'll work. They're going to launch a campaign that cannot be ignored. And it's called Operation Spectre.
Yeah, and it's both successful in the sense that it isn't ignored, but it's unsuccessful in the sense that it still accomplishes nothing. And there is the wisdom of the people who came before, but there is also this tragic sense of them too not having a true grasp of what they're up against. It's kind of like the parents who are saying to their children who have failure to launch or whatever, it's like, I was able to do it at your age. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. In order to find a job, you just got to go up to the manager. You got to look him in the eye and you got to shake his hand. That's kind of what they're doing, where they're like, we'll show you how to get this done and no one will be able to ignore it. And it's like, okay, sure, there is wisdom in that. You got to be able to do that, but you have no clue what you're up against either.
Yeah, I think if you were to look at this in an analysis of tradition, I think the thing to actually take out of the wisdom of the old masters is to appeal to the human sense of reverence and the sacred, rather than just to simply do what the previous generation did. And that's the mistake that they make, is that they simply just do what the old generation did. And so they do this huge parade through this town. Everybody takes notice. It makes the mainstream news, but the footage does get erased, or it glitches out. There's some technical error in the cameras and they're not able to capture it. But it's such big news that everybody in town is talking about it. But one of the things that townspeople don't really understand is what exactly it was. So that's another failure of their campaign. It's that the message wasn't clear. It was a huge bunch of ghouls and goblins parading through the town and scaring certain people and interacting with people in weird ways. But the message was entirely muddled. There was no way that the human beings could understand what this was all about. And one of the old masters actually memes so hard that he has a heart attack and dies on the spot.
He pulls the old Luke Skywalker and does illusion magic to death.
Yeah. So because the message is unclear, well, maybe not even because of that, but anyway, the human beings are able to spin it. And the person who ends up taking credit for this whole thing is the CEO of the new Wonderland theme park that's to be built in town. And he goes on the news and he says, "I'm sorry if I caused a ruckus. I'll pay the penalty. I'll pay the fines to the mayor. I was just trying to pull a publicity stunt for the new Wonderland to give a preview of what the Wonderland is all about." And the raccoons just get so frustrated that they put all of their effort into this one thing. And even the old master dies, and they gave it their all. And the human beings, through just using the technique of propaganda so easily, are able to spin that in their favor.
And that sort of goes to how you have just the nature of attention, and a lot of the prominent voices that do rise up, that do get some sort of following, in many cases ultimately end up getting corrupted because they have to work within the machine too. It could be a politician or whoever, but the resistance itself gets co-opted. And any attention that is garnered, once it becomes powerful enough, once it becomes strong enough, you think that it's going to knock the teeth out of the machine, but the machine just sort of pivots and says, "Oh no, that was a part of us all along."
It's really good at co-opting, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And if it's not co-opting, then the machine can always use it as justification for its next action anyway. The thing about the power of the machine and the power of propaganda is that we live in a mass society. And so as much as we want to decentralize the narrative and tell people to do their own research and that kind of thing, or have our alt media, in a society of mass communication, there's always going to be Pareto distribution, where the majority of people are going to follow one thing that is seen as the most legitimate as well. Right? There's a manner in which the mainstream media looks legitimate that alt media doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, the terrifying thing is that people just follow who they think is going to win. That's it. I mean, the majority of people anyway. So it doesn't even matter so much what's ethical, or I don't know, you look at what happened with COVID and people just hedge their bets.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that from the kind of normie perspective is that, am I supposed to believe these people on the internet, or am I supposed to believe these institutional voices? And it's a very scary proposition, because if they say, I'm going to take the side of the internet, then the internet isn't always truthful either. It's a very scary proposition, because it becomes a kind of an epistemological crisis. It's like, who am I supposed to believe then if I can't believe the mainstream institutions? Where is my grounding for truth now?
And it's not just what do I believe, but it's also, the institutions that are setting the framework of society are actively hostile towards my interests.
Yeah.
We're not on the same team. I'm prey that they're leeching off of. That's a bridge too far for most people to go across. And that's almost what's required in order to be able to accept that, turns out some of those random people on the internet are right and the institutions are wrong.
Yeah.
Or not even that they're wrong, they're just evil. Like, it's not accidental. It's not like they've accidentally stumbled across the wrong answer. It's that, no, they're portraying counter-truth, the complete inversion, intentionally.
Another plot twist happens. It's really kind of a minor plot twist, though. I think that, Bucklander, you mentioned this as well, with the foxes. There could have been a more important, significant story arc there. but there wasn't. But the movie does introduce at this point foxes. And foxes are another creature who have the same transformation magic, except that they've almost completely lost, or they have completely lost all of their homeland. This specific group of foxes has. And now they live entirely among the humans.
And I'm not sure if the implication was they literally prostitute themselves to humans.
Seems the females do. Seems well, okay. To provide further context, in Asia there is this thing called I don't know what it's called, but they're bars where they're bars where they have hosts/hostesses. It's very common actually. So when you go to a karaoke bar or a drinking bar, the bar will provide companions, usually female companions, to the male guest. And then the female companions are there to get you to drink more, to get you to have a good time, to get you to tip more. And that's their job. And so that's what is seemingly these females are doing. Not necessarily prostitution, because usually sex is not involved in that kind of thing, unless you're in Thailand.
Huh. Okay.
So foxes are actually working for Wonderland, or the foxes weasel their way into working for Wonderland, because the Wonderland CEO actually doesn't know who did the parade. And the fox says, I can find out for you. The fox in human form, this is. And then the fox goes to the raccoons to investigate, but he also kind of instinctively already knows that it must be raccoons who did this. And the fox goes to the raccoons and then makes them an offer. And he says, you should actually join with the fox way of living, which is to live among the humans. And it's not even a bad life because we have magic. And so we can actually live very well using our abilities in the human world. And one of the conflicts that arises when the fox talks to one of the raccoon leaders is the raccoon leader says, well, what about the raccoons who aren't good at transforming, who aren't capable of living among the humans? And the fox says, well, it's a Darwinian world. You adapt or you die. And that's what happened to the majority of the foxes, that a lot of them couldn't deal with the human world and died out. And so this is interesting that Laurentian shared this tweet earlier today from Kryptos, who is another Ololian scholar. Well, he's an Ololian scholar where we're just Olol fans, but yeah, I'll just bring it up. Kryptos says in his tweet, it's a thought experiment. You are given a nice life, good job, nice home, reasonably attractive, nice wife, and in return, you have to give up dissident right politics and agitation against the regime. But the price is you must know that you sold out for your nice life. Would you do it?
That's an interesting one, because here's my problem. My nice life is sort of what I'm fighting for. That's what I feel like we're doing here. Like, I'm rebelling against the inability to have that. Now, of course, no, at least I'd want to say that I wouldn't take the deal if it meant like, well, I'm selling out my bros. But isn't that what we're fighting for?
I just have a hard time thinking that that's possible. I know it's a hypothetical question or whatever, right? But I know that I wouldn't be able to just turn this off. It's like, okay, now I'm just no longer critical. And sure, I can kind of keep my mouth shut or whatever, but everything is set up in a way where you're just constantly facing all these shit tests. And you would have to essentially become the biggest virtue signaling lefty LGBT activist or whatever in order to be able to fit in at a certain point. It's not enough to just give up your politics. It's like they've made it so that you have to join them or you're exiled, right? So it's like, okay,
I think there are different forms that it can take, actually, because earlier we were talking about monasticism. Like, monasticism is another example of, from the perspective of the monk, he is living a good life in a certain sense through his giving up the world to follow Christ, right? And so that's another way. It's like, you are, in a sense, you are abandoning.
I'm not sure if he finished that thought or if he suddenly, his mic got disconnected or something. Jeff, we can't hear you.
They really don't want us to record this episode.
I can still hear you though, right, Bucklander?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, good. So we could have our own secret podcast that Jeff won't learn about until he comes back.
What?
Oh no,
Jeff
he's back.
About Pom Poko. Oh.
Am I good?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. There are different degrees to which you can sell out the movement. That's what I was saying. we were talking earlier about monasticism, and monks abandon the world to pursue something different, right? But it's to pursue something higher. And so monks are abandoning their bros too, right? And to pursue something else. But that's a different degree of abandonment. It's different from the guy who completely sells out and becomes a leftist shill. So I think it's a matter of things that you value. Because a monk values
is there
pursuing, following Christ more than he pursues the world.
I think though, being a monk's a vocation, and not everybody's meant to be a monk.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there have been times when being a monk has been taken to excess. At least from a political perspective. But one of the things that I've heard that why the Byzantine Empire fell is because they developed this like monk mania, and everybody was like, it was a huge thing, like to go and be a monk. And one of the reasons why there's always this problem with the settling of Anatolia, because the European side of the Byzantine Empire did all right, but the Asian side was always struggling with its population. And the argument is like, if the Byzantines culture had not been so crazy about becoming monks, then they would have more thoroughly settled Anatolia and had more of a population base to resist the Turks.
I would make the argument that it cuts both ways then, because not everybody is meant to be a revolutionary. The whole the whole dissident thing is not everybody's cut out for it.
You need 10%. If you got 10% of the population that's devoted to their autistic fucking crusade, we're gonna win. And we just need to stick to that.
So there's a manner in which if people decide to take the deal and just live a non-dissident life, despite knowing about the movement, it's not necessarily betrayal. I mean, everybody's kind of built for something different, I think.
You got to know your strengths. And this is one of the things that came up with the, like, you got to do something. Like, there was this moment in book club between me and someone, and I was like, this is a generational conflict that we're in. I don't think we're going to really even know what to do for a decade. I think things will emerge. And I kind of said this, like, we gotta read more. We got to really think about things, and we got to diagnose the problem. And someone said, well, what have we been doing for the last year? Like, we've been doing this for a year. Surely we're there now. And I'm not telling the story to be like, and Bucklander was right. The point of the story was that there's some people whose function is to go and, start doing. So there's some guys who need to infiltrate the system. There's some guys that need to go out and live in the woods and set up the time capsule, like some sort of reserve. And there's some guys that need to think and read. We're not all the same, and that's okay. We here on the alt-right love diversity. And it goes for a bunch of different things. I've developed a new political theory. And I realized in developing this new political theory, I've basically just invented the patriarchy. Because all I want is like rule of the dads. And then my friend pointed out, isn't that just patriarchy? And I went, oh shit, yeah, it is. But I want things to get bad enough that dads are just like, no, you're not doing that. Like, come on, wake up. I'm not going to let you do that. And that, when dads start doing that, I think we're going to win.
There's also a reason why East Asian cultures are more patriarchal. They've managed to hold on to patriarchy for long, even though to some degree that's kind of going away as well. It's because we have this understanding. It's called filial piety, right, in Confucianism. But this is a huge thing where we understand old people are wise. Maybe not all of them, but in general, old people know things that young people don't. And also that society has to hold to a hierarchy or it's going to fall apart. And that hierarchy can't be every revolutionary generation overthrowing the previous. There's certainly a history of that in China as well. So there's this understanding that we've seen how that turns out, and that can't be the way to build going forward. That your parents are your parents, honor your mother and your father, I mean, ultimately. But it goes all the way up too. It's like we understand that kings know more than peasants know. We understand that perspectives are different in a hierarchy. That when you're lower, you don't see the fullness of the big picture, but you do see things in more finer detail.
Yeah, so like allow specializations to emerge.
Yeah.
But also acknowledge that maybe your buddy Dave, who, just wants to grill, don't alienate him.
Yeah.
Better that you don't push him into their arms than, you know what I mean? Like, better that he stays neutral, because all those guys are like, oh, wait, you think the trans stuff is a bit out there? Well, so do I. But like, better that they maintain that kind of natural position than we make them go, wow, Jeff was an asshole today. I guess this trans stuff is okay. I don't know.
Well, you know how that works is because they see all of us being assholes, and they're like, well, these guys aren't my people either.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't want to be associated with these people either. So I don't really have a political home. Or maybe the other people, at least they're not assholes and I can get along with them.
But I think, why are we assholes to one another? Well, one, there is the issue of punching right.
Yeah.
But the other is the expectation that, like, even guys that more or less agree on stuff, they can give each other shit for like methods.
Yeah.
Why? What does that do? And you see that with the raccoons. They all want the same thing.
Yeah, another confrontation that reminds me of is when we were doing episode 6 of the Quigley stream about National Socialism. And this guy comes into the chat and he's like, aren't you guys going to talk about when the revolution is going to take place? And it was like, dude, we're fucking YouTube content creators who like to read.
I'm flattered.
There's definitely an element of you're never pure enough unless you're fed posting. And like, okay, well, that's not helpful either. So I guess we're screwed.
Okay, so the raccoons, they do consider the fox's proposal, but actually what ends up happening is the raccoon leader instead tricks the foxes. He convinces the fox and the CEO of Wonderland to bring $1 million to this meeting. I think the meeting was meant to pay off the raccoons to join the Wonderland project. And then they end up stealing the $1 million. I'm not sure what the meaning of that is, but...
It's interesting that they can't feed a forest full of raccoons for a couple of decades off of $1 million.
Oh, yeah. What the...
Like I said, I don't want to pull that thread too much. There might be...
Oh, you know what's interesting? The raccoon who steals the $1 million is the raccoon master who comes from a foreign land. And then later on, he goes back home. So he takes the $1 million with him. Damn, that's like some grifter. I know that Trump is the easy answer. I'm not going to say Trump. I don't think it's Trump, but it's someone who comes and who represents our side and then just runs off with $1 million.
Yeah. I don't think there's much. I don't think much should be read into that.
Yeah. So it turns out that the raccoons, they gave so much to Operation Spectre that they didn't prepare for winter. And a lot of them really struggle through the winter. And I think there's something there to be said about you can't just completely focus all of your into this one thing. There's still life outside of politics to take care of. So there's a danger there.
It is at this point in the plot where the Tanuki's political movement begins to fragment and disband. Various leaders in the movement now begin to form splinter groups that go on to act independently and increasingly towards their own demises. Ganta rallies up the remaining raccoons who still have the will and appetite for physical confrontation, and his party members decide to assume the form of radical human environmentalists who are trying to protect the forest from further development. Their small troop ultimately settles on making one last violent stand against the humans who attempt to remove them. And ultimately, in one final decisive confrontation with the police, Ganta invokes the kamikaze spirit of old Japan, fearlessly proclaiming that even if he and his allies were to fall in this battle, that their brethren would pick up the cause and continue fighting into the future. And that no matter the odds, they would always fight to the death.
So yeah, this act of the movie is all about ballsack magic because we see ballsack magic take 2 different forms. And with the ballsack imagery, one of the things that he's getting at is masculinity. It's like, what's the masculine way to go out? And for Ganta, it's to fight to the death. And for this other group, who also uses ballsack magic, the way that they see the masculine way is to go out on your own terms in a different way.
While Ganta and his troops meet their final end in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, another contingent of raccoons take a radically different approach to trying to go out on their own terms. Master Hage, one of the old masters from Shikoku, recruits a number of the Tanuki who are unable to transform into a Japanese Buddhist cult that invokes the ancient ritual of Futaraku Tokai, or crossing the sea to the pure land in the south. In this ritual, the participating members board a boat that is set to sail out and never return. In an act of ritual suicide, the participants believe that they will ultimately transcend all of their earthly cares and finally find themselves at peace at the shores of the mythical dwelling place of a revered bodhisattva. Master Hage constructs this boat using his scrotal magic, and his cult members joyously set sail on it towards their collective deaths. These raccoons, similar to the ones in Ganta's party, also go out on their own terms in spectacular fashion, believing their choice to be noble. And in the end, some would see their actions as tragic, while others would hail them as valorous. But, for the compatriots that they would leave behind, this would be the darkest and most sorrowful moment of their entire endeavor.
But I guess, yeah, at least the way that I see it, there's something very tragic about the way that this group of raccoons includes their campaign. Because later on, and I would actually make another contention, is that the ending of Pom Poko is a Christian ending. And we're almost there, actually. So the Buddhists end up committing ritual suicide, and that's the end of them. And then the raccoons actually sent 2 emissaries out early on in the campaign to go recruit the masters from other regions. And it's been 3 years now since this began. And finally, the other raccoon returns from a different island, and he didn't successfully recruit any master because the master of that island had died. He was hunted, I think. And so he returns empty-handed. And he comes back and he sees that the development has gotten to such a point where he doesn't even recognize his homeland anymore. And he kind of laments, well, what happened? You know, our homeland has been destroyed. And the raccoons, it's a moment of mourning when they realize all that's taken place in the last 3 years and how this is basically the end. But in one final idea, I think it's the matriarch raccoon who proposes, we're going to do something this time. We're going to do another meme, but this time it's not going to be about stopping the onslaught of the technocracy. This time it's not going to be about stopping the humans.
What it is, if I can make an homage to one of our guys, she proposes a positive vision for the raccoon alt-right.
Yeah. I think this is one of the first times that there's a future-oriented vision.
But it's also past-oriented.
Yeah. What is the term that Nietzsche uses? There's antiquarian, there's critical, and then there's...
I don't know.
It's in the use and abuse of history. Nietzsche says is that there's these 2 views of history. Well, there's 3 views of history, but the problem is most people attach themselves onto the first 2. And one of them is antiquarian history, where people just simply look back to the past golden age and say, we should return. Things were so much better than tradition. And then the other one is critical history, where people look back on history and say, all of that was bad. Tradition was bad. It was holding us back. You know, the future. And Nietzsche says that what we really need to do is actually take on a third view of history, which is that there were good things in the past, but we have to carry those good things into the future. That tradition can't simply die with the past, that it is this living thing where we stand on the shoulders of giants. But because we carry that torch, we have to find a way that we're going to make that torch ever burn brighter and pass it on to the next generation.
I wonder if Heidegger doesn't get response to technology from that, because that's a very technology is what it is. You know, it's like that scene with Gandalf. He says to, is it Mary? Mary's like, oh, I wish this had never happened to us. Gandalf says, well, so do all those who live in such times, but it's not for us to choose and we can't go back. We're here. We're thrown into this situation, and we have to learn to live with it. And the ones that will thrive are the ones that will deal with the reality of where we are. And we're not going to go back. We're not going to put these things away. So how do we move forward in a way that is not just conceding ground to them? How do we move forward? And it's difficult.
And I see some of this in the Christian tradition as well, where Christianity always engages with the philosophy of the time, like how a lot of the early church fathers engaged with Greek philosophy. St. Justin Martyr, for example, I think is one of the more prominent examples, where the way that he engages with it is that he sees how elements of the modern is kind of like a revelation of the Christian story, how it fits into the Christian story. And in a way, we can even see things like that nowadays, where certain patterns that emerge in the modern world, they also fit into certain patterns in the Christian story. And sometimes that can be taken too far, granted. There is a danger to going too far into allegory, but at the same time, we believe the unfolding of history is another way in which God reveals himself. And so there is this manner in which all things that happen in the world do reveal God in some way, that we can see God in everything. And so that's why I think the ending of Pom Poko is also very Christian. There's this idea of bearing witness. And, the word martyr itself means witness. Martyrdom isn't necessarily just to die for the faith, although that is certainly a form of martyrdom and bearing witness. But I think more broadly, there's something to be said about the ability to bear witness and then to pass that on. So what the Raccoons do in their final campaign is to use their magic to present this great vision of what the forest looked like before it was paved over. And so they recreate all of the old farms, the old trees, the old walkways, and even some of the people who were there. And then the citizens of Tama Hill recognize some of those elements. And they say, hey, that's where my grandpa used to live. And they see the beauty of the forest. And they kind of recognize, the humans finally recognize that there is something a little bit tragic about building this suburb over what was once there. And then going forward, the humans actually start to take more of this into consideration as they continue developing. So the forest may be gone, but some of the spirit of the forest lives on. And they start considering things like green space and ways to coexist with the local fauna. And they start developing this reverence for raccoons, actually. Some of the kids are like, oh, I wonder if the legends are true, that the raccoons did know magic. And the raccoons kind of become this part of the identity of the town.
It just sucks that one way or another, everyone's still stressed out. Yeah. Like whether the raccoons transform into humans and they're constantly living on energy drinks, running from one place to another. That's very stressful because it's against their nature.
Yeah.
And then the raccoons who remain raccoons, they're super stressed out because they're having to dodge traffic in order to get scraps of food, and their way of living in the forest is gone. Mm-hmm. So in both cases, there's no easy choice.
Right. And actually to that point, there's this montage of Shokichi living among the humans. But it actually also shows not only the raccoons living out of balance, but humans themselves. Right. They're also living not according to their nature.
It's interesting that the humans and the raccoons, the problems they're having come from the same thing, which is that there's a area of philosophy. There's an area of this sort of stuff, not just philosophy, called posthumanism. And posthumanism is not transhumanism. Yeah, it is not transhumanism. The understanding of it is something like, well, humanism is the idea that like we're very powerful, where we have the ability to act in the world, we have the ability to like do stuff, and we have real like agency in the world. Yeah. And posthumanism questions that, and it says maybe we're not as powerful as we think we are.
Yeah.
And so like the humanist account of agency is that we have this thing called agency, and it's fundamentally dependent upon like having a mind, having like this intentional desire to act on the world. And posthumanism says something different about agency, which is that agency, if we're right that humans are a lot less powerful, there isn't quite the same intentionality. Agency is the product of humans interacting with the worlds and like responding to what they see. It's not all intentional. And
it's surprisingly Christian
you
in that
think so?
we don't fully understand the kind of bondage that we have to the world.
I mean, do you think Elul was a post-human?
Elul was a Calvinist.
Yeah, that doesn't, so he could still be, are you saying Calvinists aren't Christian?
No, I'm saying that, well, no, I'm just saying he was a Christian, but you know, a lot of people, like, well, one of the objections that a lot of people find to Elul is that he seems to have a very deterministic view that technicity will ultimately dictate all of human action going forward, gradually, more and more at least. But I don't think that his analysis is necessarily not in line with orthodoxy. I mean, the way that we understand it is like, there is a thing as human free will and agency, but at the same time, there's also a manner in which we don't understand just how much the world can bind us. That there are forces out there, spiritual and worldly, that make us not ourselves, right? That inflame our passions and cause us to do things where we aren't totally in control. And that's why we need Christ, ultimately.
We're coming up on 3 hours. If we don't pass it already.
Okay, well, we are at the end. And in the very final part of the movie, Shokichi is living among the humans. He's taking the subway. He's working an office job. And then he sees these other raccoons who are unable to transform, scavenging for food. And he follows them through this sewer pipe to a golf course. And he finds that a lot of his old pals are actually living on this golf course. And then they get together again.
I like that. Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was a golf course.
Yeah. They reunite and they have this moment of like rejoice to be with one another again. And
I feel bad for Shoshiki because now it's not just like, oh, I'm a raccoon living with this as a human. Now, presumably, like he's got all the other things that a human has to worry about, like mortgage payments. Like, you know, like it's, I don't know. I wonder if the raccoons that are unable to transform got off later, you know? Was it worth it? This Faustian bargain.
Initially, the first few times I watched, I found the ending to be really blackpilling. That, you know, this is what the raccoon civilization has been reduced to, living on golf courses or, you know, working desk jobs. But, you know, I think if you zoom out further, you can kind of see that the raccoons live on, like they bear witness. And it's something like you can't kill the truth. That even in that last meme that they do, even the humans get a glimpse of the truth. That something has been lost in our reckless progress towards, you know, this future vision, right? That ultimate truth is preserved despite how much things keep advancing. And that there are these raccoons who will live on golf courses. There are these raccoons who will live in human society, but in them is where the truth will be preserved. And I don't know, maybe a lot of people will ultimately see that as a black pill, but as Christians, you know, we read the book of Revelation and we understand like things can get pretty bad, but ultimately we know who emerges victorious.
Yeah, I mean, there is no denying that something was lost, like things have changed. And what it's created is there's like a bifurcation where you have the distinction, the separation between the raccoons who can transform and the ones who can't. And overall, they're still stressed out in both camps. And I kind of wonder if we're looking at something like, is this a transhumanist story as well from the raccoon's perspective, a trans raccoonist story? Because some of them they kind of climb up the ladder of being and go from being raccoons to being humans. Part of me is like, well, that's kind of part of our story too. There's some of us who are going to plug into this machine. Like right now, everyone's connected to it to a certain degree, but eventually people are going to have to make the decision to give all of themselves over to it or not. And then there'll be that bifurcation of humanity itself.
We are in a hard fork moment, right? I've thought about this a lot. And I don't think it's one decision. I think it's like many decisions. Like if you got the vax, I don't think like, oh, well, you're not going to make it, right? It's not that. Like it's going to be the accumulation of lots of decisions, and we're going to end up with two distinct pathways for humanity, and not just two distinct pathways for humanity, but two distinct types of human. And the worry is, well, which side's going to win? And, you know, there's this like appeal to saying like, well, I'd rather kind of like stay a wolf than become a dog. The problem is there's a lot more dogs than wolves nowadays. The domestication process is rewarded by the system. You know what I mean? Like
there's a manner in which the technological society does domesticate us. It makes us house cats, right? It makes us completely reliant on this outer shell of technology. You know, there's very few humans nowadays who can abandon it all and go live in the woods without, I mean, most of us can barely live without the internet. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But there is one thing that I also want to say. It's like, there's a manner in which the truth is actually more fully revealed through the difficult times that we go through. So rather than saying we should go back, I think the more healthy view is to say that we should go through this, because there's a way that different layers of truth are revealed through different unfoldings in history. And so on the one hand, it is bad what's happening today, but on the other hand, a different aspect of the truth is being revealed through it. So on the other hand, I'm not advocating for accelerationism. I'm not saying that we should, you know, just see how far we could take Drag Queen Story Hour. But I'm saying that one thing
Drag Queen Story Hour accelerationism?
Yeah. But I am saying that there's a manner in which we deal with these things is that to understand what truth is being revealed in them.
I'm going to go with one of my old ones. A black pill is just a white pill in a small time frame.
Yeah.
We don't know where we're going. We don't know what the plan is. But I think ultimately we have reason to be optimistic. And don't give up hope, even however hard that is. Also, learn to have fun. Learn to smile and laugh as you win and you lose. Because we have more fun than they do, guys. I don't know about you, but I like that. I like the fact that, okay, we might be black-pilled, but we know how to laugh. Right? Like there's that bit in Nietzsche where Zarathustra is like, oh, I could laugh or I could cry, right? Yeah. Something like that. Anyway.
All right. Thank you guys for joining me. And I'm glad we finally got to this after discussing it for so many years.
Can I suggest in maybe 5 years to a decade, we do Howl's Moving Castle?
That was a good movie, though. I'm glad that you recommended we do an analysis of it. I probably wouldn't have seen it otherwise. It would have just been one of those things.
Yeah. And so one other plug for more interesting analysis on modern media and how some of that ties into, well, certainly Christianity. Please go check out Nathan's channels. Link in the description.
Yeah, thanks. We just finished up The Hidden Meaning of the Talos Principle.
That's right. I wanted you to watch the Barbie movie because it's actually not entirely Gnostic. Well, it's in some elements, but maybe not. But I think ultimately the Barbie movie is a Christian movie.
That's right. I've had some people bring that up. Actually,
I've heard people that were like, not our guys who liked Barbie, and not our guys and didn't like Barbie, and I've heard our guys that like. I've heard every combination of people talking about Barbie.
Well, that settles it. In 5 years, we're going to be doing the Barbie movie analysis. Like and subscribe.
I got something on that day.
Hit the notification bell for that.
After the boys disbanded that day, they would not see one another again for the next 8 weeks. Jeff would be sidelined by a minor health scare that would require a quick surgical procedure, followed by a very painful month of recovery. Nathan would find himself busy with new responsibilities in the home and beyond. Laurentian, meanwhile, would upgrade his internet service in the hopes that he could continue to record podcasts from the comfort of his tractor. without too much grumbling from his peers and the general audience. And as for Bucklander, it would be immediately on to the next project for him. A new 15-part lecture series on the history of ancient Sumeria, as seen through a Spenglerian analysis. All in all, life would keep them plenty busy, with many surprises along the way. And, just like the Tanuki, they wouldn't have everything planned out, but they also had much to feel optimistic about.